Welcome to Rejected Knowledge. This is another installment now, just a few more chapters, in the book The History of Tammany Hall by Gustavus Myers, over a century old. Of course it's Rejected Knowledge. We start out now with Chapter 30, Tammany Under Absentee Direction, 1901 to 1902. In the municipal campaign of 1901, the anti-Tammany forces combined upon the nomination of Seth Low, a Republican, for mayor, and upon the nominations of various other candidates for city offices. Tammany's candidate for mayor was Edward M. Shepard. Both Mr. Low and Mr. Shepard were acclaimed by their respective supporters as men of standing, prestige, and public character. Mr. Low was a man of wealth who had become president of Columbia University. Mr. Shepard was a lawyer of note, although some critics pointed out that his practice was that of a corporation attorney, serving the great vested interests. It may be remarked that Mr. Shepard was a son of the brilliant Lorenzo B. Shepard, who, as stated in Chapter 16 of this work, became a leader of Tammany Hall at so early an age, and was chosen Grand Sachem of the Tammany Society. The scandals of Mayor Van Wyck's administration were conspicuous issues of the campaign of 1901, but there were two particularly noteworthy features pressed by the reformers in their indictment of Tammany. One of these issues, which made so deep an impression upon the public mind, especially in the densely populous east side of New York City, was the flagrant immorality under which young girls of the tenderest age were often decoyed into lives of shame. The question thus presented was neither that of the quote-unquote suppression of vice, nor that of how people could be made virtuous by mandate of law. The question, as put to voters, was whether a system under which a corrupt, money-making combination of vicious lawbreakers with police and other officials should be allowed to continue an abhorrent traffic. A widely circulated pamphlet published by the City Club for the Women's Municipal League presented a series of facts as attested by court records, as well as the statements of city magistrates, the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, and others, and as reported by the Committee of 15, composed of reformers probing into the question. The pamphlet declared that the facts justified the conclusion that the business of ruining young girls and forcing them into a life of shame for the money there was in it for the dealers had recently grown to considerable proportions, that its existence was known to the police, that the police made little or no effort to stop it, that the police, or those for whom they acted, probably derived profit from the traffic, and that a reasonably active and efficient police department could stop the traffic of a deliberate merchandising of the virtue of women, usually young girls. Details were given of numerous cases which had been passed upon in the courts, and a long description of the traffic was included from a statement made on October 21st, 1901, by District Attorney Eugene A. Philbin of New York County. Justice William Travers Jerome of the Court of Special Sessions had already made a similar statement. He was quoted in the New York Times of June 27, 1901, as saying, quote, "People are simply ignorant of conditions on the east side of New York City. If those conditions existed in some other communities, there would be a vigilance committee speedily organized, and somebody would get lynched. The continued greed and extortion of the police captains who charge $500 for a disorderly resort to open their precinct, and then collect $50 to $100 per month, has, however, made even vice unprofitable. Details, I know, are revolting and not nice to read, but yet the people ought to know about them." Yeah, same old, huh? You could say the same and then some about today. Wow. Just yesterday I sentenced to 6 months in the penitentiary the keepers of one of the most depraved houses of the East Side. I firmly believe that they were merely the agents of the man who owns not one but many such places. He is well known as a politician in a certain notorious district. That house is but one of hundreds within a radius of 1 mile of this building, the criminal courthouse, where criminals are sometimes brought to justice. I will stake my reputation that there are scores within less than that distance from here, in which there are an average of 10 or 12 children from 13 to 18 years old." Unquote. Nominated for District Attorney of New York County by the anti-Tammany forces, Mr. Jerome's speeches on these existing conditions made a keen impression and excited the deepest feeling, especially among the people of the East Side. Intricate questions of taxation and arrays of figures proving an exorbitant budget and the waste of public funds could not make the same appeal to their indignation as the portrayal of conditions menacing their home life and polluting their environment. The facts thus spread forth caused the most intense resentment against Tammany. In reply, Tammany Hall sought to represent that the traffic thus described was largely mythical, and that, at all events, it was greatly exaggerated. It was no fiction, however, nor was police connivance and corruption a fiction either. So far as the open flaunting of vicious conditions was concerned, Tammany Hall had itself been forced to recognize them. As a concession to public opinion, Mr. Croker had, in November 1900, appointed an anti-vice committee with orders to investigate vice conditions and, quote-unquote, clean up the, quote-unquote, red light district. To impart a tone of good faith to the work of this committee, he had appointed Lewis Nixon, a Naval Academy graduate, and a shipbuilder, its chairman. It was generally understood that this committee had been created as a clever campaign move to offset in the public mind the growing indignation against Tammany, many of the leaders of which, it was notorious, had profited richly from the system of police, quote-unquote, protection of vice. In respect to the white slave traffic, however, it must be said, in justice to Tammany, that the factors attributed were not the only ones responsible, and such a traffic was far from being confined to New York City. It went on in other cities under Republican and Reform as well as Democratic rule. This was conclusively shown later by the necessity of the passage of a law passed by Congress aimed at the traffic, parentheses, a law subsequently diverted somewhat from its original purpose, end parentheses, and by official investigations and court proceedings. The large number of prosecutions in the federal courts under that law showed the widespread character of the traffic. Another important issue of the municipal campaign of 1901 was the scandal growing out of the charges that William Whitney, Thomas Ryan, W. L. Elkins, P. A. B. Widner, Thomas Dolan, and associates had looted the stockholders of the Metropolitan Street Railway Company of New York City of tens of millions of dollars. Whitney and Ryan were credited with being among the chief financial powers long controlling Boss Croker, and by means of his control of Tammany Hall, and in turn New York City, securing franchises, privileges, and rights of enormous value. This control was often equally true of the New York State Legislature. Subsequent developments, in fact, revealed that in years when the legislature was dominantly Republican and therefore could not be ordered by Mr. Croker, both Republican and Democratic legislatures were corrupted by the Metropolitan Street Railway Company or by agents acting for it. According to Mr. W. N. Amory, who was thoroughly familiar with the affairs of the Metropolitan Street Railway Company and who exposed its looting, Mr. Jerome knew in 1901, quote, that the conduct of metropolitan affairs was corrupt. We had on numerous occasions discussed that point, unquote. Mr. Jerome made profuse public promises that if he were elected district attorney, he would press investigation. Let me tell you, he said at the conclusion of a speech on October 26, 1901, that if I am elected, I shall make it my business to follow the trail of wrongdoing and corruption, not only when they lead into tenement houses, but I shall follow them even if they lead into the office of the Metropolitan Street Railway Company. Mr. Jerome added, no one knows better than I do that when I am attacking the Metropolitan Street Railway Company, I am arraying myself against the most dangerous, the most vindictive, and the most powerful influences at work in this community, unquote. Mr. Jerome's denunciations and promises aroused great enthusiasm and large expectations. They had much effect in contributing to the result of the campaign, for it was popularly realized that while Tammany leaders accumulated their millions of dollars, yet back of these leaders, and secretly operating through them, were magnates of great financial power, with their tens or hundreds of millions of dollars acquired largely by means of financial and industrial power conferred by legislation, permissory, or statute of various kinds. He's talking about the super-rich there. Somebody finally mentioned them. Of course, way to go, Gus. The electorate well knew that comparatively small grafters were numerous, but now it had the promise that the large spoliators, hitherto immune, would be exposed and prosecuted if possible. Good luck on that one. Didn't happen then. It's never going to happen. The result of the election was that Mr. Lowe was elected mayor by a plurality of 31,636. Nearly all of the other anti-Tammany candidates for the large offices were also elected, although Tammany's candidate for the borough of the Bronx, Louis F. Haffen, was successful. The total vote stood: Lowe, 296,818, Shepard, 265,177. For other political parties, a small vote was cast. Benjamin Hanford, candidate for mayor of the Social Democratic Party, received 9,834 votes. Kennard, Socialist Labor candidate for mayor, polled 6,218 votes, and Manier, Prohibition candidate for mayor, 1,264 votes. That of a total vote of 561,990 votes cast for the two chief opposing candidates, Tammany and its allied organizations should have polled 265,177 votes, showed Tammany Hall's enormous strength, even in the face of a combination of opponents, with all the strength of definite issues obviously putting Tammany on the defensive. Realizing that the attacks upon him personally as the boss of Tammany Hall and of the city had been successful in a political sense, Mr. Croker wisely concluded, immediately after this defeat, to obscure himself and give an appearance of retiring from active participation in the affairs of Tammany Hall. Conscious, too, of the public discredit attaching to Tammany's methods and Tammany's leaders, he saw that the time had come to inject some show of an element of respectability and reform into Tammany Hall. He now underwent the formalities of an quote-unquote abdication. On January 13th, 1902, the astonishing news was made public that he had selected Lewis Nixon as his successor as the leader of Tammany Hall. Mr. Nixon at this time was 41 years old. Hailing from Leesburg, Virginia, he had been graduated from the United States Naval Academy and had become a naval constructor, later owning his own naval ship plant at Elizabeth, New Jersey. He was also connected with a number of private corporations. In 1898, he had been appointed by Mayor Van Wyck to the office of President of the East River Bridge Commission, and in 1900 to 1901 had acted, as we have seen, as chairman of Mr. Croker's Anti-Vice Committee. When the educated Mr. Nixon assumed what he styled the leadership of Tammany Hall, not only seasoned politicians of all grades, but also the sophisticated smiled skeptically. Tammany district leaders maintained in public an air of profound gravity and obedient acquiescence, which caused general amusement. And when Mr. Nixon solemnly discussed his plans for the improvement of Tammany Hall, he was popularly regarded as innocent. Even when Mr. Croker, as an apparent token of good faith, made Mr. Nixon chairman of the Tammany Finance Committee, few considered his appointment seriously. He was generally dubbed, quote, the Phantom Leader, unquote. Having attended to Mr. Nixon's installation, Mr. Croker sailed abroad to his estate at Wantage. To all nominal appearances, he had severed himself from Tammany politics. This comedy lasted but a few months. On May 14th, 1902, Mr. Nixon sent his resignation as leader to the Tammany Hall Executive Committee. He accompanied his resignation with a speech in which he declared that since he had become chairman of the Tammany Hall Finance Committee, he had found himself so hampered by a quote-unquote kitchen cabinet headed by Andrew Friedman, Mr. Croker's business partner, and by the continued interference of the absent Mr. Croker, that he could no longer lead Tammany Hall and retain his self-respect in the circumstances. Mr. Nixon announced, quote, "Every important act of mine has been cabled to England before it became effective. Mr. Friedman and his party interfered with me at every turn, and at last sought to dictate to me whom I ought to place on the Board of Sachems. Then a cablegram came from Wantage, Mr. Croker's estate, direct to me, to place certain men on the Board of Sachems, and when I rebelled, I found that at every turn I would be opposed by this coterie of interferers. I found that nearly all my important acts had to be vicied before they became effective. Many of the district leaders would accept my orders, but before carrying them out, they would get advice from Mr. Croker." Unquote. With this announcement, Mr. Nixon vanished from the scene of Tammany politics. As a matter of fact, certain Tammany district leaders were already planning to bring about a change of actual leadership. On May 22, 1902, the Executive Committee of Tammany Hall took steps which tended to sever the relation that Mr. Croker retained with the organization. It voted to recommend the abolition of the Subcommittee on Finance, which had always been presided over by the various bosses of Tammany Hall, thus eliminating from the chairmanship of that committee Andrew Friedman, who was the representative and mouthpiece of the absentee Mr. Croker. At the same time, the Executive Committee chose a triumvirate of leaders to guide the organization. The Regency of Three thus selected were Charles Murray, Daniel McMahon, and Lewis Haffen. All three, of course, were Tammany district leaders. Mr. Murphy's career is described hereafter. Mr. McMahon was chairman of Tammany's Executive Committee and head of the contracting firm of Naughton and Company. It was this company that made a fortune from the contract for changing the motive power of the Third Avenue Railway, regarding which there was so much scandal. With nothing more than a powerful political pull, this concern obtained large contracts. It was charged by John Sheehan that Richard Croker secured 50% of the profits of this company, and that he pocketed $1,500,000 from this source. This assertion, however, depended merely upon Mr. Sheehan's word. It was not established in any official investigation. The third member of the triumvirate, Mr. Haffen, was now president of the Borough of the Bronx. But this triumvirate did not last long. On September 19, 1902, it was effaced, and Charles Murphy became the boss of Tammany. This action was taken at a meeting of the Executive Committee. At this meeting, former Chief of Police Devery, holding that he had been elected at the primaries, tried to have himself recognized as a district leader, but his claims were speedily disposed of, and he was shut out. Mr. Haffen handed in this resolution, quote, "Whereas the experiment of the Committee of Three having proved the desirability of individual responsibility in leadership, resolved that the powers and duties heretofore exercised and performed by the Committee of Three be hereafter exercised and performed by Charles F. Murphy." Unquote. 9 Tammany district leaders headed by John Carroll, who evidently aimed at power himself, opposed the resolution, but 27 other district leaders voted it through. One of the leaders immediately sent a cablegram to Mr. Croker announcing the result. Now that Mr. Murphy was chosen leader, he also became the treasurer of Tammany Hall. Chapter 31. Charles F. Murray's Autocracy, 1902 to 1903. Charles Francis Murray, supreme leader of the Tammany organization from 1902 to this present writing, was born in New York City on June 20th, 1858. He was a son of Dennis Murphy, an Irishman whose 8 children all were born in the same district in New York City, and all of whom obtained the rudiments, at least, of a public school education. Dennis Murphy, it may here be said, lived to the remarkably hale age of 88 years, dying in 1902. As a youth, Charlie Murphy worked in an East Side shipyard, by no means a genteel schooling for a boy, although affording a forceful kind of experience of much value in his later career. Having to fight his way among rough youths, he developed both physical prowess and a sort of domineering ascendancy which gave him marked leadership qualities among the virile youths overrunning what was then a district noted for its gangs. It was a section of the city filled with vacant lots and was long called the quote-unquote gas house district. Here it was that the notorious quote-unquote gas house gang achieved local reputation. Tradition has it that when a very young man, Charlie Murphy organized the Sylvan Social Club, a species of Tammany Hall juvenile auxiliary composed of boys and youths ranging from 15 to 20 years of age, of whom he became the recognized leader. Later, through political influence, he obtained a job as driver on a cross-town horse car line. In his later career, his enemies invidiously related how jobs of that kind were much coveted at the time, because of the fact that as there were no bell punches or car fare registers, the conductors could easily help themselves to a proportion of the fares and divide with the drivers. True, this practice was prevalent, but the implication thus cast upon Mr. Murphy has simply been a gratuitous one, lacking even the elements of proof. It can therefore be dismissed from consideration. He was a manly youth noted for his filial care, a solicitous son, turning in most of his earnings to his mother. He was, in fact, the main support of the family. At the same time, he put by enough money, said to have been $500, to establish himself in the saloon business. In 1879, he became owner of a diminutive saloon on 19th Street, east of Avenue A. 4 years later, he opened another saloon, larger and better equipped than the first, at the corner of 23rd Street and Avenue A. He was already a pushy, resourceful Tammany worker in his district, in which he was a district captain. Of the underground methods and diversified influences of district politics, he had a good knowledge, and no less so the application of campaign funds in the most effective ways for producing votes. Shortly before 1886, Mr. Murphy opened another saloon, this time at 19th Street and 1st Avenue. Subsequently, he opened still another saloon at 20th Street and 2nd Avenue, which was the headquarters of the Anawanda Club, the Tammany District Organization. Selling out the original saloon in which he had started business, he now opened a saloon at the northwest corner of 1st Avenue and 23rd Street. By 1890, he was the owner of 4 prosperous saloons. It was said of him that he never tolerated a woman in his saloons, although all of his saloons were situated in a district where the admission of women was a commonplace. In 1892, at the age of 32 years, he was chosen Tammany leader of the Gas House District. He was popular with the generality of people there. However reserved was his talk, he was always credited with being generous with his cash. No poor person was turned away empty-handed. It was narrated of him that during the blizzard of 1888, the Tammany General Committee, at his prompting, voted $4,000 for the relief of the poor, and that a large part of it came from Mr. Murphy's own pocket. Of the $4,000, the sum of $1,500 was given to the Reverend Dr. Rainsford's mission for distribution. Such personal acts of human warmth, irrespective of motive, counted more with masses of voters than tons of formal polemics on civic virtue. Nor did the recipients care as to what sources the funds came from. Even Dr. Rainsford was so impressed that he was moved to say from the pulpit of St. George's Church that if all the Tammany leaders were like the leader of the 18th Assembly District, Mr. Murphy, Tammany would be an admirable organization. As a district leader, Mr. Murphy carried on politics and saloons systematically as a combined business. One of his brothers had long been on the police force. Another brother was an alderman. Still another brother became an alderman and councilman. When Mr. Van Wyck was elected mayor, Charles F. Murray was appointed a dock commissioner. Report had it that when he went into the dock board, Mr. Murphy, quote-unquote, was worth perhaps $400,000, accumulated in the saloon business and politics in 18 years. He had long been known as, quote-unquote, Silent Charlie. Within a few years after his appointment as dock commissioner, his fortune, it was said, reached at least $1 million. When he became dock commissioner, Mr. Murphy nominally assigned his 4 saloons to a brother and 3 old friends. Before leaving the office of dock commissioner, John J. Murphy, Charles Murphy's brother, James E. Gaffney, and Richard J. Crouch, one of Charles Murphy's political district lieutenants, had incorporated the New York Contracting and Trucking Company. Gaffney was an alderman. These 3 men were credited with holding only 5 shares each of the 100 shares of the company. Just who held the remaining 85 shares has never been definitely explained. When quizzed later by a legislative committee, Charles Murphy denied that he had any ownership or financial interest in the New York Contracting and Trucking Company, and no records could be found proving that he did have any interest. One of the transactions of this company was as follows. In July 1901, the company leased a dock at West 96th Street, and it leased another dock at East 79th Street, paying the city a total rent of $4,800 a year for the 2 properties. It would appear from a report subsequently made by Commissioner of Accounts William Hepburn Russell to Mayor Lowe that the average profit from the two dock properties was $200 a day, making a rate of 5,000% on the investment. This particular transaction of the New York Contracting and Trucking Company, lucrative as it was, nevertheless was modest compared to the company's subsequent transactions, which we shall duly describe. Certainly, by the year 1902, Mr. Murphy showed the most visible evidences of some sizable degree of wealth. He acquired a suburban estate at Good Ground, Long Island, owning too, in time, among other possessions denoting wealth, a string of automobiles. This millionaire leader of Tammany Hall was by no means an unpleasant man to meet. He had a certain diffidence, and he was not a good talker. His old habit of attentively listening was too strongly fixed. Physically strong, his deep voice and direct, concise manner when he did speak were impressive and always concentrated on the business at hand. He had none of the ordinary vices. He drank liquor occasionally, it was true, but his drinks were sparse and the times far separated. In smoking he did not indulge, neither did he swear, nor gamble at cards, although he was not a stranger to stock market speculations. A communicant of the Epiphany Roman Catholic Church, he attended Mass every Sunday and gave liberal donations to the church. Unlike Mr. Croker, Mr. Murphy never cared to make the Democratic Club his headquarters. Every night, when a district leader, Mr. Murphy could be found from 7 to 10 o'clock leaning against a lamp-post at the northwest corner of 20th Street and 2nd Avenue. Everybody in the district knew that he would be there, accessible to anybody who wanted to talk to him. Such were the career and characteristics of the new leader of Tammany Hall, a dictator, in fact, yet preserving all of the tokens of democratic accessibility. Mayor Lowe's administration failed to make an impression calculated to influence a majority of voters to re-elect him. Quite true, most of his appointees to head the various departments were men of character, administrative capacity, and sincerity of purpose. Radically different types indeed from the Tammany district leaders who were usually appointed to those offices under Tammany administrations. But in appointing Colonel John N. Partridge as Commissioner of Police, Mayor Lowe chose a weak and inefficient man. The demoralized condition of the police administration under Tammany had long been the special target of the reformers' attacks, and people had expected a wholesome overhauling of that department under Mayor Lowe. Colonel Partridge's administration, however, was so disappointing that the City Club was moved to demand his resignation. It criticized Commissioner Partridge for taking no adequate measures to break up the alliance between the police and crime, or to get a proper understanding of the underlying conditions in the police department, and further criticized him for surrounding himself at headquarters with notoriously corrupt officers, one of whom, in fact, was made his principal uniformed advisor. The City Club's criticism did not charge that Partridge was personally corrupt, but that he was weak and gullible and was ignorant of real conditions. Quote, Commissioner Partridge and his deputies adopted the idea of ruling the police force according to military ideas. The word of a superior officer was accepted absolutely, as against that of a subordinate. In a force where the superior officers had, for the most part, secured their promotions by bribery, where the superior officers were the beneficiaries of blackmailing, and where the honest men, as a rule, remained subordinates. Oh, yeah, well, isn't that all of life? Isn't that all of politics? Isn't that all of official religiondom? Where the honest men, as a rule, remain subordinates. That's this worldly existence. That's everything. The attempt to instill a spirit of respect among the men for their superiors excited only ridicule and added to the prevalent demoralization. Unquote. True as such a general statement was, it has been equally true, as experience has shown, that various other reform police commissioners have vainly tried, quote, to break the system, unquote. Temporary figures, commissioners, come and go, but, quote unquote, the system has remained more or less intact. Even General Francis V. Greene, appointed by Mayor Lowe, January 1st, 1903, to succeed Colonel Partridge, parenthesis, who resigned the day before the trustees of the City Club's demand for his resignation was handed in, end parenthesis. Even General Francis Greene found this to be a fact, notwithstanding his earnest, conscientious efforts to correct conditions in the police department. The vote of the body of the police force themselves showed, in 1902, their complete dissatisfaction with conditions. At least 75% of the police force voted for Lowe in 1901. A year later, fully 90% voted for Bird S. Kohler, Tammany's candidate for governor. This was only one of many indications of a forthcoming Tammany victory. Even some reformers criticized Mayor Lowe as at all times ready to denounce the Tammany leader, from whom he could expect nothing, while refraining from saying anything against Senator Thomas C. Platt, the Republican boss, who represented and headed a political machine element not materially different from that of Tammany. Mayor Lowe, it was also critically pointed out, was not of a type to hold the goodwill of a large body of the proletarian voters. His views, his manner, his leanings were all of an aristocratic order, and in a city where class distinctions were so notoriously and effectively exploited by Tammany Hall, nothing could be more destructive to the endurance of an administration than the popular belief that its head, however honest personally, embodied the interests and smug views of the people of wealth, that he was, in the expressive phrase of politics, quote-unquote, a silk stocking. Various acts of Mayor Lowe's were cited against him and deepened this impression in the popular mind. Mayor Lowe's supporters pointed out energetically that he had reduced the city's debt by $7 million, that he had reformed the system of tax collection, that he had secured for the city adequate payments for public franchise grants, that he had defeated corrupt quote-unquote jobs, that he had reformed the public school system, that in every way he had been a thorough reform mayor. These representations, the election results showed, were all in vain. Yeah, that's just what Ferdinand Lundberg wrote about on a few pages in his giant tome in 1967, The Rich and the Super Rich. When he talked about voting, he said, among many other things, that the mass of people are idiots, basically. He said it in a more erudite way, but his conclusion was that the mass of people are idiots. And they don't know who or why or what they're voting for, and they shouldn't be voting. And his conclusion also was that the system was probably too corrupt to be trusted anyway. So either way you lose. Anyway, continuing. With conditions favorable to its return to power, Tammany Hall took measures to make its ticket in the municipal campaign of 1903, headed by a candidate whose name stood for prestige and respectability. Tammany's candidate for mayor was George B. McClellan, whose father of the same name, after serving as commanding general in the Union Army during part of the Civil War, had been the Democratic candidate for President of the United States in 1864. A political protege of Charles F. Murray, George B. McClellan had seen service in Congress and had been selected by Mr. Murphy as Tammany's candidate for mayor a considerable time before the campaign opened. Jealousy antagonistic to Tammany's domination and assertion of supreme power, the Brooklyn Democratic Organization, then under control of boss Hugh McLaughlin, opposed McClellan's nomination, but Mr. Murphy carried his point. To the amazement and chagrin of the Republicans and Fusionists, Tammany Hall then consummated a bold and astute political stroke by appropriating two of the three principal nominees of its opponent's ticket and nominating them as Tammany candidates. These two men were Edward M. Grout and Charles V. Fornes, respectively occupying the offices of Controller and President of the Board of Aldermen under Mayor Lowe's administration. With Mayor Lowe, they had been renominated. Thus did Tammany shrewdly weaken the other side and present itself as having two chief candidates of the same identity and capacity as those of the reformers. Mayor Lowe and his supporters did not accept this unhumorous situation complacently. They indignantly forced Grout and Fornes off their ticket, but the effect sought by Tammany had been produced. Mr. McClellan was elected mayor by a plurality of 62,696. The vote resulted: McClellan 814,782, Lowe 252,086. Furman, candidate for mayor of the Social Democratic Party, received 16,596 votes. Hunter, the Socialist Labor Party's candidate for mayor, 5,205 votes. For the prohibition ticket, 869 votes were cast. In this election, Tammany also elected its candidates, including Grout and Fornes, to all of the other important city offices, except the presidency of the borough of Richmond. The results of the election practically gave Tammany Hall full control of the city. And that's where we'll leave off for this time. Coming up to the end of the book, there are just a few more chapters left. This Gus Meyer's history book here. The history of Tammany Hall. Wow. Does this ever make the act of voting look nothing else than foolish? All right, folks. You've been listening to Rejected Knowledge.